You were 4 years old, tears streaming down your face because another kid broke your favorite toy. And then your mom, exhausted, frustrated, looked at you and said the words that would change everything. Stop crying. You're just too sensitive. In that moment, something inside you died. It wasn't your heart that stopped beating. It was your soul that learned to hide. And decades later, you're still paying the price for that one sentence. Because that wasn't just a simple scolding. It was the first brick in the construction of an emotional prison that psychologists often call narcissism. The number one cause of narcissistic development isn't the extreme abuse you see in movies. It's not the constant beatings or screaming matches. It's something much more subtle, much more common, much more devastating. It's the systematic invalidation of a child's emotions through a phrase that millions of mums and dads say every day without understanding the damage they're causing. You're too sensitive. Stop crying. It wasn't that bad. You're exaggerating. These words, repeated hundreds of times throughout childhood, don't just hurt. They reprogram. They teach a child that their feelings don't matter, that their pain isn't real, that who they are fundamentally is wrong. And here's the part that no one ever tells you. When a child learns that their feelings are unacceptable, they don't just stop feeling. They learn to pretend they don't feel. They construct a mask, a false self, a version of themselves that's acceptable to their parents. And that mask, over time, becomes the narcissistic armor that psychologists see in adults who can't connect emotionally with anyone, including themselves. Let's go back to that 4-year-old. The toy is broken, they're crying, and the mom, instead of validating their pain, says, "Stop crying." But why does the mom do that? Why do parents systematically invalidate their children's emotions? The answer is disturbing, because they were also emotionally invalidated children. Because when their child cries, something inside them activates, an unconscious memory of when they cried and were punished for it. And instead of offering their child the comfort they never received, they repeat the same pattern. They pass on the same wound. There's a concept in psychology called emotional mirroring. When a baby is distressed, they look to their mother's face for validation. Is it okay to feel this? Am I safe feeling this? And when the mother mirrors back with empathy, with presence, with validation, the baby learns that their emotions are acceptable, that they are acceptable. But when the mother responds with irritation, with denial, with invalidation, the baby learns something very different. They learn that there's something fundamentally wrong with who they are. And that is the seed of narcissism, not the grandiosity you see on the outside, but the devastating emptiness that exists within. It's a core wound, a primal scream echoing through years of unacknowledged pain, a concept that Jung would relate to the repressed shadow self. Now that child is 6 years old. They come home from school crying because they were excluded from a game. And again, the mom, instead of offering comfort, says, "You're just too sensitive. They'll play with you tomorrow. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." And the child, who's already learned that crying is unacceptable, swallows their tears, forces a smile, pretends everything's okay, and another piece of their authentic soul dies. Another brick is added to the emotional prison. And the false self, that mask created for survival, becomes stronger, more rigid, more impenetrable. Psychologists who study narcissistic development have identified something fascinating. Narcissists aren't people who love themselves too much. They're people who can't love themselves at all. Because the real self, the one that felt and cried and needed, was rejected so systematically in childhood that it had to be buried. And in its place, a facade was constructed, a persona, A grandiose self that doesn't need anyone, that doesn't feel pain, that's always in control. But underneath that mask, there's a terrified 4-year-old who's still waiting for someone to say it's okay to cry. And here's where it gets even crueler. When that child grows up and becomes an adult, they can't tolerate emotions in others. When their partner cries, they feel repulsed. When their child is distressed, they feel irritation. Why? Because the other person's emotion activates the buried emotion within themselves. And that 4-year-old starts screaming from inside the emotional tomb where they were buried. And the only way to silence that scream is to invalidate the other person's emotion, to say exactly what their mother said. You're exaggerating. It wasn't that bad. Stop being so dramatic. This is the generational transmission of narcissism. It's not genetics. It's unprocessed trauma passing from generation to generation through a simple phrase, "You're too sensitive." And the tragedy is that most parents who say this aren't monsters. They're wounded people, trying to raise children while carrying their own unhealed wounds. They genuinely believe they're helping, that they're teaching resilience, that they're preparing the child for a harsh world, but what they're really doing is creating another narcissist who will invalidate the emotions of the next generation. Let's talk about what happens neurologically. When a child hears that phrase repeatedly, when an emotion arises in a child and it's consistently invalidated, the brain starts to create a disconnection between feeling and expressing. The child still feels the emotion, but they learn to suppress it so quickly that eventually they lose conscious access to it. It's as if the brain says, since this emotion only brings punishment and rejection, let's pretend it doesn't exist. And that emotional dissociation, that cut between the real self and the self presented to the world, is the essence of narcissism. Now that child is 10 years old, they don't cry anymore. In fact, they pride themselves on not crying. They mock other children who cry, call them weak, too sensitive, dramatic. They've completely internalized their mother's voice, and more than that, they've developed contempt for any sign of vulnerability, in themselves or in others. Because vulnerability was the thing that brought rejection, so they need to destroy any trace of it. And that contempt for vulnerability, that inability to tolerate weakness, is what later manifests as the characteristic cruelty of the adult narcissist. But here's what no one told you. That contempt isn't strength, it's terror. It's the terror of a 4-year-old who learned that showing need leads to abandonment. And the only way to never experience that abandonment again is to never need anyone, never be vulnerable, never cry. So the adult narcissist builds a fortress of self-sufficiency, a defensive grandiosity, an emotional armor so strong that no one can get in, but also so strong that they themselves can't get out. She's trapped. Inside the prison she built to protect herself, there are very specific moments in childhood where this programming crystallizes. One of them is when a child falls and scrapes their knee. It's bleeding, it hurts, and they run to their mom seeking comfort. And the mom, instead of offering a hug, says, "You're fine. It's nothing. Stop crying." And the child looks at their own blood, feels their own pain, and receives the message that their perception of reality is wrong, that what they feel isn't real. This is a form of gaslighting, and when this happens repeatedly, the child starts to doubt their own experience, starts to prioritize the parent's narrative over their own internal truth, and that's the death of authenticity. It is precisely this process that Carl Jung warned against when discussing the dangers of neglecting the shadow self. Another crucial moment is when the child is scared of the dark, scared of being alone, scared of a nightmare. And instead of validating the fear, the mum says, "Don't be silly. There's nothing to be afraid of. You're too big to be scared of that." And again, the message is clear. Your feelings are inappropriate. You shouldn't feel what you feel. There's something wrong with you for feeling this way. And the child, who can't change what they feel, learns to hide what they feel, learns to perform the version of themselves that is acceptable, and this performance, over time, becomes so automatic that they forget they're performing. They forget there's a real self, buried under all those layers of defense. This is, in essence, the narcissistic armor Jung described, a protective shell built to conceal a wounded core. Let's talk about anger. When a child gets angry and expresses that anger, and the mom says, "Don't raise your voice at me, don't be rude, don't get angry over that," the child learns that anger is unacceptable. But anger doesn't just disappear because it's unacceptable. It goes inward, turns into internalized anger. Anger against themselves for having needs, for having feelings, for not being perfect. And this internalized anger is what psychologists see in narcissists as deep self-hatred, masked by superficial grandiosity. This is precisely where emotional mirroring, or lack thereof, comes into play. And here's the cruel irony. The mom who says, "You're too sensitive," often does it because she herself is emotionally overwhelmed. She doesn't have the resources to deal with her own emotions, let alone the emotions of her child. So when the child expresses emotion, it further overloads her already depleted system, and she reacts not out of cruelty, but out of survival. She needs to make that emotion stop because she can't handle it, but the child doesn't understand that. The child internalizes the message that there's something wrong with them for having feelings. Now let's talk about what happens when this child reaches adolescence. They've developed an efficient persona. They're the one who never complains, the one who solves everything on their own, the one who doesn't need help, the one who's strong, independent, capable. And everyone around them praises these qualities. What a mature boy, what a responsible girl. But inside, there's a growing emptiness, a feeling of unreality, of being disconnected from themselves, of living someone else's life. And they don't understand why they feel this way, because society says they're doing everything right. But doing everything right, when you've buried your true self to do it, is the essence of the narcissistic tragedy. This echoes the concept of emotional invalidation, where a person's feelings are dismissed or rejected, leading to a disconnect from their authentic self. And when this teenager eventually gets into relationships, they repeat the pattern. When the partner expresses emotional need, they feel repulsed. When the partner cries, they withdraw. When the partner asks for vulnerability, they attack. Because vulnerability, need, emotion, all these things represent that buried place inside them that was rejected, and they can't tolerate in the other what they can't tolerate in themselves. So they invalidate, reject, punish the partner's vulnerability in the same way that their vulnerability was punished, and the cycle continues. This can often be attributed to generational trauma, where harmful patterns of behavior are passed down through families, impacting emotional expression and relationships. But there's something even deeper happening here. When a child is systematically invalidated, they don't just lose connection with their emotions, they lose connection with their essence, with who they really are, separate from the expectations of their parents, because their entire sense of self has been built in reaction to rejection. They've become the opposite of what was rejected. If emotion was rejected, they've become someone without emotion. If vulnerability was rejected, they've become invulnerable. If need was rejected, that they become completely self-sufficient. But all these qualities are just defenses. They're not the real self. They're the armor that protects a self that wasn't allowed to exist. And here's the saddest thing. This buried self doesn't die. It stays frozen in time. At 4 years old, still waiting for validation, still needing to be seen, heard, comforted. And all the narcissistic behavior of the adult, all the grandiosity, all the need for admiration, all the inability to empathize, all of it is a desperate attempt to protect that 4-year-old from experiencing that original rejection again. But the tragedy is that the very protection is what keeps the wound open, because as long as that child is buried, as long as that pain isn't felt and processed, healing can't happen. You see the consequences of such acts reverberating into adulthood. You probably know someone like this, someone who seems to have it all together on the outside, but who's emotionally inaccessible, someone who can't tolerate criticism, who explodes in disproportionate anger when they feel questioned, who can never admit they're wrong, who always needs to be in control. And you might think that this person is selfish, narcissistic, mean. But what you're really seeing is a terrified child inside an adult body, using all their energy to keep buried, a pain they don't have the resources to feel. The false self becomes their persona. And if that person is you, if you recognize these patterns in yourself, the first thing you need to understand is that it wasn't your fault. That child you were did what they had to do to survive. They buried their feelings because showing feelings led to rejection. They built an armor. Because vulnerability wasn't safe, they became self-sufficient. Because need was punished, they did all this to survive. And they survived. You're here. You made it this far. But surviving isn't the same as living. And the armor that protected you as a child is now imprisoning you as an adult. Let's talk about the exact moment when the narcissism crystallizes. It's when the child makes an unconscious decision, a decision to never be vulnerable again, never need again, never be that rejected child again. And that decision, made at 4, 5, 6 years old, becomes the organizing force of their entire adult life. All the relationships, all the career choices, all the defense mechanisms, everything is structured around that primary decision. I will never be vulnerable again. And as long as that decision is in charge, genuine connection is impossible, because connection requires vulnerability. And vulnerability, that's what brought the pain. And here's where a lot of parents watching this are going to start feeling guilty, because they recognize they've said these phrases. You're too sensitive. Stop crying. Don't be so dramatic. And they didn't understand what they were doing. They were tired, stressed, overwhelmed. They were repeating what their own parents said. But if you're that parent, hearing this now isn't to make you feel guilt. It's to give you a chance to break the cycle, because awareness is the first step to change. And if you can recognize the pattern, you can choose different. You can be the point where the generational transmission stops. Because the truth is, healing narcissism isn't about making the person less grandiose. It's about making it safe for them to become vulnerable again. It's about creating a space where that buried child can finally emerge and be seen, heard, and validated in the way they always needed. And that requires a very specific type of therapeutic relationship or personal relationship, one where vulnerability isn't just allowed, but it's honored, where emotion isn't punished, but received, where need isn't shameful, but human. But before that can happen, the person has to recognize that there is a problem. And that's the biggest obstacle, because the very essence of narcissism is denial. The denial that there's anything wrong. The denial that there's a wounded child buried beneath all that armor. The denial that all that grandiosity is just a defense. And admitting that you're hurt, that you need help, that you don't have everything under control, that requires the exact kind of vulnerability that was punished in childhood. That's why narcissists rarely seek help, because seeking help means admitting need. And need was the thing that brought the original rejection. So what happens is, they go through life repeating the pattern, invalidating the emotions of others, because they can't tolerate their own emotions, rejecting vulnerability in others, because they have to keep their own vulnerability buried, creating children who will grow up and do the same thing. And the wound, the original wound of that 4-year-old who was rejected for crying, that wound passes from generation to generation without ever being healed, just transferred, just replicated, just perpetuated through that simple phrase, "You're too sensitive." But what many don't realize is that phrase has variations, all equally destructive. Stop being dramatic. It wasn't that bad. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. Others have much worse problems. You should be grateful. Why can't you be strong like your brother, Mike? Each of these phrases carries the same fundamental message. Your experience isn't valid. Your pain isn't real. You're wrong for feeling what you feel. And when a child hears this repeatedly, they internalize not only that their feelings are wrong, but that something is fundamentally wrong with who they are for having those feelings. Let's talk about a particularly toxic dynamic. When the child finally stops expressing emotions, when they finally bury everything and present that perfectly controlled mask, the parents often interpret this as maturity. What a mature child, never complains about anything, always so calm. And they reinforce this. They give attention and approval to the false self, to the mask. And so the child learns that the false version of themselves is lovable, while the real version has to remain hidden. This creates a deep dissociation, a sense of living two lives, the public life where everything is always fine, and the internal life of emptiness and disconnection. This is fertile ground for that Jungian shadow self to take root. And here's something that most people don't connect. Perfectionism isn't a virtue in someone who grew up emotionally invalidated. Perfectionism is a symptom. It's the child trying to be so perfect, so impeccable, so beyond criticism, that they'll finally receive that validation that they never received, but it doesn't work, because no matter how perfect the person becomes, that internal 4-year-old still hasn't been seen, still hasn't been validated, still waiting for someone to say, it's okay to cry, it's okay to need, it's okay to be human. And when that child, now an adult, has their own children, something interesting happens. A part of them wants to do different, wants to give their child what they never had. But when the child cries, when the child is distressed, that internal 4-year-old is activated. And suddenly it's not just the child crying, it's herself at 4 years old, crying, and all that defensive system, built to never feel that pain again, kicks into action. And she hears herself saying the same words her mum said. "You're exaggerating. Stop crying. It wasn't that bad." And she hates herself for it. But she can't stop, because to stop, she would have to feel that original pain, and that pain has been buried so deeply, covered with so many layers of defense, that accessing it seems impossible. This is what psychologists call intergenerational trauma. It's not that the person chooses to pass the trauma on, it's that the unprocessed trauma inside them gets activated in the presence of the next generation's emotion. And the only way they know how to deal with that activation is to do what was done to them: invalidate, suppress, deny. It's an automatic reflex, a survival mechanism that becomes a mechanism of perpetuation. Let's talk about conditional love, because that phrase, "you're too sensitive," carries an implicit condition. I love you when you're strong. I love you when you don't need. I love you when you're not being dramatic. But when you show vulnerability, when you express need, when you have emotions, you're too much, you're too sensitive, you're unacceptable. And the child internalizes this as, I'm lovable only when I'm not myself, only when I perform the version of me that my parents approve of. And that's the essence of conditional love. And conditional love isn't love. It's a contract. And the price of that contract is the soul of the child. And here's the thing about adult narcissists that most people don't understand. When they're being cruel, when they're invalidating your emotions, when they're making you feel like you're crazy for feeling what you feel, they're not doing it because they're evil. They're doing it because it's what was done to them, and they never learned another way. They literally don't have the emotional map to validate another person's emotion because theirs was never validated. It's like asking someone who's never seen the ocean to describe the waves. They don't have the reference. They don't have the internal resource. But here's what gives hope. The human brain has neuroplasticity. It can form new connections. And that means patterns learned in childhood can be unlearned in adulthood. But it requires three things. First, recognition that there is a pattern. Second, a willingness to feel the original pain that was buried. Third, a safe environment where vulnerability is allowed. And these three things, especially the second, are incredibly difficult for someone with a narcissistic structure, because the very idea of feeling that original pain activates all the defense mechanisms that were built to avoid feeling exactly that. So how does change happen? Usually, it happens through a crisis, a collapse of the false self, a moment where all the defenses fail, and that 4-year-old child finally emerges. And it can be terrifying. It can feel like a complete breakdown of identity, because in a sense, that's exactly what it is. It's the collapse of a false identity built for survival. But behind that collapse is the possibility of finally finding the true self that was buried so long ago. If you're watching this and recognizing these patterns in yourself, the first thing you need to know is that recognition is already a huge step, because most people with narcissistic wounding spend their entire lives in denial, denying that there's something wrong, denying that there's a wounded child buried inside, denying that all that grandiosity and self-sufficiency is just a defense. So if you can see it, if you can recognize that 4-year-old child inside you who was rejected for crying, you've already started the healing process. If these stories are resonating deeply with you, if you're starting to see connections between your childhood and your current patterns, this channel exists exactly for that reason. To help you understand psychological dynamics that shaped who you've become, to validate experiences that have been invalidated for so long, to offer understanding where there's only been confusion. If this content is valuable to you, consider supporting through Super Thanks. Every contribution allows me to continue researching, learning, bringing these deep psychological insights to you. Because these stories need to be told, these patterns need to be exposed, and this validation needs to be offered. But healing isn't just recognition. Healing requires feeling. And feeling is the most terrifying thing for someone who's spent their entire life avoiding feeling, because when you finally allow those buried emotions to emerge, When you finally feel the pain of that 4-year-old child who was rejected, it's devastating. It's not just sadness, it's anger. Anger for the stolen childhood, for the lost authenticity, for the years lived through a mask. And that anger, when finally allowed, can feel like it's going to destroy everything. But the truth is, it's only destroying the defenses. It's breaking down the prison. It's clearing the way for that buried child to finally be free. And here's the part that no one prepares you for. When you start this process, the people around you might not like it because they related to your false self, to that version of you that was always strong, always capable, always in control. And when you start to show vulnerability, when you start to express need, when you start to cry, they might respond exactly like your parents responded. You're changing too much. You're being dramatic. I preferred when you were stronger, and that can be re-traumatizing. It can make you want to go back to that armor, but if you can get through that, if you can maintain that vulnerability, even when it's rejected, something shifts. You stop needing the external validation that you never received because you're finally giving yourself the internal validation you've always needed. And let's be clear about something. Healing from narcissistic wounding doesn't happen quickly. It doesn't happen through one insight or a self-help book. It happens through years of painful work, of dismantling defenses that took years to build. It happens through feeling emotions that have been buried for decades. It happens through creating new relational patterns where vulnerability is safe, and it demands a level of courage that most people don't have. Because it requires doing exactly the thing that was most dangerous in childhood, being vulnerable, being real, being that child who cries when something hurts. But here's what happens. When you finally do that, when you finally let go of that armor, when you finally allow that 4-year-old child to be seen, heard, comforted, you discover something surprising. You discover that real connection, real love, real intimacy were only impossible. Because you were locked inside a prison of defenses, and when those defenses fall, when that armor is removed, suddenly you can feel again, you can cry again, you can need again, and you discover that all those things that were punished in childhood, that had to be buried to survive, are exactly the things that make you human. They're exactly the things that allow connection. They're exactly the things that connect you with yourself and with others in a real way. And then one day, you're with your own child, and your child is crying because something hurt them, and that 4-year-old internal child is activated. But this time, instead of repeating the pattern, you do something different. You kneel down to your child's level, you look them in the eyes, and you say the words that you always needed to hear. It's okay to cry. I see that you're in pain. Your feelings matter. You matter. And in that moment, two healings happen simultaneously. Your child receives the validation that you never had, and that 4-year-old child inside you, through the act of giving your child what they never received, finally starts to heal. That's breaking the cycle. It's not perfect. You'll still have moments where the old patterns emerge, where you hear your mom in your own voice, saying, "Stop crying." But now you have awareness, and awareness gives you choice. And choice gives you the possibility to do things differently, to be the point where the wound stops passing from generation to generation, to be the adult that child inside you always needed. And here's the final truth. That phrase, "you're too sensitive," is only destructive because it carries the message that feeling is wrong. But what if the message was different? What if, when a child cried, the response was, "I see that you're feeling something big. Want to tell me about it? What if vulnerability was received with presence instead of rejection? What if need was seen as human instead of weakness? What if a child could grow up knowing that all their feelings, all of them, were acceptable, were valid, were part of what made them human? That child wouldn't need to build narcissistic armor because they wouldn't need to protect themselves from rejection. They would know on the deepest level that they were lovable exactly as they were, and that experience of unconditional acceptance is the antidote to narcissism. So, if you're a parent, if you have kids, here's what you need to understand. When your child expresses emotion, they're not trying to manipulate you. They're not being dramatic. They're not being too sensitive. They're being human. They're showing you their inside. And your response in that moment is going to shape how they relate to their own emotions for the rest of their lives. If you respond with emotional invalidation, you're teaching them that there's something wrong with who they are. But if you respond with presence, with validation, with comfort, you're teaching them that their emotions are safe, that vulnerability is safe, that they are safe. And that is the greatest gift you can give. It's not protection from all pain. It's the message that whatever they feel, you're there, and they don't need to hide any part of themselves to be loved. This resonates with Carl Jung's concept of integrating the shadow self, accepting all aspects of oneself, even the uncomfortable ones. And if you are the child who grew up hearing, "You're too sensitive," if you are the adult who's still carrying that wound, still performing that armor, still hiding that 4-year-old kid who just needed to be seen, here's what you need to hear. It wasn't your fault. You weren't too sensitive. You weren't too dramatic. You weren't exaggerating. Your feelings were real. Your pain was real. You deserved to be comforted, not rejected. You deserved validation, not invalidation. And that child inside of you who's still waiting to hear that deserves to finally receive the message they always needed. It's okay to feel. It's okay to need. It's okay to be human. You don't need to wear that armor anymore because you're not in that place anymore where vulnerability meant danger. You're here now, and now you can choose to do differently. This aligns with Jungian psychology, which emphasizes individuation, becoming your true self by integrating all parts of your psyche. Which of these phrases did you hear the most growing up? "You're too sensitive," "Stop crying," or "After everything I've done for you"? Share in the comments. Sometimes just naming the experience is the first step toward healing.